Well, thanks so much, Edith. Well, it's really great to see so many people left in the room at this time of the day. I've purposely retitled my presentation, even though this session is about technology, chosen the word approaches purposefully, because I think novelty is not just about technology. There are approaches that are also novel. I think that's a very important distinction there to remember when dealing with food waste management. And also on purpose, I'm talking about managing food waste and not reducing food waste alone. Okay, again, there's a big difference there. And of course, sustainability as well. Okay, you know, inevitably, one can't talk about food waste without the proper context. And I'll explain later what I mean by that particular context. I'm supposed to disclose that I'm overworked by these organizations, but there's no conflict of interest at all between what I'm going to say and the examples I'm going to be using in my affiliations. Okay. I'm supposed to be retired, but it's not the case. Okay. So what I'll do is, now that I have a bit of extra time, I'm going to talk a bit about the context, the raison d'etre, basically, for food waste management. Why talk about it? What really is so important about it? Yeah? And then share a little bit about some of the novel approaches to managing food waste. And I've broadly categorized those into mindset changes and real technologies themselves. Okay? So that's roughly what I'm going to cover. Okay, so the raison d'etre, you know, for managing food waste. I will put to you, and we've heard quite a bit about, you know, these aspects in the past few sessions, last 2 days. Food security is a major driver. Yeah, I think we heard lots of figures, you know, given to us this morning by different speakers. And of course, sustainability is the other one. And again, I will put to you that food security is definitely an integral part of sustainability. Yeah, without the stability aspect of food security, it's tough to think about sustainability. Then thirdly, you know, the cultural aspect, which I think Gail mentioned a little bit as well, you know, the right thing to do. Okay? And that comes in two aspects. One is kind of the morality, you know, ethics part, and the other really is the financial part, the financial driver, as to why it's the right thing to do. I hope to give you examples, especially examples from Asia, which is really quite exciting in terms of managing food waste at the moment. A lot of stuff happening there. So food security, I think pretty obvious, you know, that you can't talk about food security and ensuring food security unless you maintain a proper balance between having food available and food that's lost or wasted. Okay? I won't bother about defining food security. I think most of us know what it is. There's multidimensional, complex, and so on, really. But the fact is that losses do occur. We know they do occur. You know, I still recall when I first came to the US as an overworked, underpaid assistant professor in the University of Minnesota, my first conference was on loss assessment in 1980. And those were days when folks were just starting to think a bit about loss assessment. Yeah? But things have come a long way since then. So losses do occur at all stages of the supply chain, or today we call them food systems, basically. Yeah? So food systems are made up of supply chains. Estimates by FAO, and FAO incidentally had a big program in the 1970s, a global program on loss assessment, which kind of petered out over the years, but has been replaced since then a few years ago. And the estimates vary, I mean, 30 to 50%, and those are very general figures. In some systems that I've studied, the losses could be 100%. I mean, totally, basically. You lose everything that you produce. You really don't recover anything at all. Now, what is also interesting is that from the consumer perspective, and I won't touch households, you know, surveys have shown that most consumers do not link food waste to sustainability, which is interesting. Okay? To them, sustainability means something else. Yeah? And in Singapore in particular, yeah, it's a fascinating point because we're starting to develop a pretty sophisticated middle class in Singapore, and most of them are demanding sustainably produced food without really understanding what it means. Okay? So this has put F&B, you know, operators, you know, really at a loss of what to do. I mean, I get lots of questions asked, where can I source sustainably produced rice? And I tell them there's no such thing at the moment. And nobody's producing sustainably produced rice, basically. When there are other categories, labels that you can use, you know, like rice produced under GAP and so on, but not sustainably produced rice. Anyway, to increase the level of circularity, and this came up this morning. I won't use the term circular economy because I really don't think it means very much in practice. Yeah, circularity, in fact, is a very important concept. You really can't consider circularity and sustainability without looking at food waste. And I'll share an example of how it's actually put into practice in what I would call micro circularity systems, not the circular economy that we all think about in a big way. So that's kind of an introductory comment there. Now, the supply chain is something that I think all of us really like to show. The fact that, especially in Asia Pacific, almost every country in Asia Pacific depends on long supply chains to assure food security. Okay? And what is most interesting is that, somebody talked about animal protein this morning. 70% of the world's soybeans go to Asia to produce the animal protein that we eat. Okay? In fact, at meetings I've been to, we like to say that we're actually really thankful that the Western Hemisphere has so much water, because we're importing tons and tons of virtual water into Asia to the soybeans. Otherwise, we couldn't afford to eat the chicken, the fish, and the hogs that we want to eat. Yeah? So that's really interesting. Supply chains are important, and the fact is that losses and waste occur all throughout the supply chain. So what I wanted to really illustrate with this particular supply chain diagram is that it's not just a one-way traffic. There's a feedback mechanism operating. Consumers on this end, they're aware consumers, in fact, are now feeding back and demanding that all the practices along the supply chain be changed, okay, as part of their concept of sustainability. Okay? And we'll have a chance to talk a bit more about that. Yeah? Now, this seminal paper from FAO that came out in 2011, and it's a paper that we use a lot, certainly in my circles anyway, to show the differences between developed countries and developing economies, especially with respect to production, to retailing losses, and then the losses that occur at the consumer level. Okay? The bottom line really is that developed countries tend to have low loss and high waste. Okay? And Singapore is an interesting example of that. I think in Singapore, there's not that much loss along the supply chain. But at the consumer level, and consumer meaning not just at the household level, but also institutionalized consumption, which is what I'm going to focus on, there's very high wastage, which is being tackled now. Developing countries tend to have high loss and low waste. For a very simple reason. I'm full of useless stats. When you think about how the percentage of a household's family's household income spent on food, in developing countries, it goes from 40% to 60%, really. So in developing countries, families can't really afford to waste very much at all. Yeah? Whereas in developing economies, like Singapore, for example, the average Singapore household spends about 8% of household income on food. Yeah? So they can very well afford to waste, and they very well afford to higher prices too for food. Yeah? So that's some of the kind of background drivers that influence our thinking here. And this is just some figures here, in regards to Singapore. The average, per capita loss is 155 kilograms, although that changes from year to year, obviously. Okay. So if we step back a little bit and ask ourselves, what are the main drivers and sources of food waste that can be linked to consumption, to consumers? Okay? And in fact, Gail has mentioned some of these, and even earlier speakers. The quality standard for appearance. Things are rejected, at the manufacturing end, because we perceive that they don't meet certain requirements that consumers want, whether it's a size issue or non-size issue. I see this particularly in the case of fish. Okay? Wild-caught fish versus farm fish. Wild-caught fish inevitably very variable in size, different size and weights, whereas farm fish tend to be harvested at the same time. Okay? And it's actually very interesting in terms of what consumers would choose with respect to size to suit their cultural habits. Yeah? Then if you look at the wholesale retail level, aesthetic standards, obviously. Yeah? Again, with quite high loss, actually, certainly in Singapore and some of the neighboring countries in Southeast Asia, because consumers don't want those blemished fruits and so on. Yeah? But that also, would suggest that technology has a big role to play in ensuring non-blemishment. And I'll point out one of those disruptive technologies later on. Yeah? Now, of course, in terms of food services, which has, is of great interest to me, really. Again, this was mentioned, I think, by Gail at the household level, portion sizes. Okay? Some studies have been done, certainly in Singapore and the Philippines, to show that by changing portion sizes, you can really reduce waste significantly. And a story I usually like to tell is that coming back to the States, occasionally. I'm always shocked by the portion size. I mean, it's not something for me. I probably eat half. Yeah? So I'm a big contributor to food waste here when I'm here in Tampa. Like last night, our group went out for dinner next door, and I ordered a fish. And the whole fish came. I mean, that's enough for a family, basically. So what do? You know, you can't send it back because you're going to pay for it. But I thank Bunyi for paying for that fish. Thank you, Bunyi. So that's one. Then consumer attitudes towards leftovers, both at home and in restaurants, and of course refused food as well. Again, I think in the middle class amongst the developing countries, there's growing a culture now of being more assertive in terms of refusing food. It doesn't meet the expectations of what they're paying for. That is a major cause of waste. Telling a story, I convened a food loss and waste expert group meeting several years ago, and we had a delightful group of students from Hong Kong who went underground for their project to try and see how much waste, food waste, was the result of refused food. Okay? And it was shocking. In some Chinese restaurants, they found as high as 60% of refused food. Yeah? It was quite amazing when you think about it. Yeah? So anyway, I think Fergus mentioned sustainability just now. Yeah? Now, at this meeting so far, I haven't heard much talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. And SDG 12.3 aims to cut global food waste in half at the retail and consumer levels by 2030. Okay? And again, what is interesting is that as far as the SDGs are concerned, it strikes me that the developing countries of the world are paying a lot more attention to the SDGs than the developed economies, with the exception of the Nordic countries, which are really gung-ho on the SDGs. Yeah? So this is something that I think we need to kind of take more seriously. Yeah? How do we, in fact, comply with the SDGs if we're going to meet all the targets by 2030? Okay? I might come back to it a little bit later if we have time. So this was a meeting I mentioned after the seminal FAO report came out. We decided to convene an expert group meeting. And this is where I belong to this think tank as well, called the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies. And the reason we termed it that way is that non-traditional security should receive the same attention as military security. What is non-traditional security? It's water, labor, food, and energy. These four should really receive as much attention as military security. And we hope that by doing so, by having this center, we're elevating the issues to the government. And we've been partially successful to actually do that. Yeah? So from this expert group meeting, we had 3 recommendations, basically, which tend to stretch the technology policy interface. Again, I think it was this morning, I think somebody asked the question to one of the speakers about, what are the policy implications? And I believe the answer was that, I'm a scientist, I'm a researcher, I don't touch that. Now, I think that's one of the weaknesses that we have as scientists. Okay? We can't not get involved in basically policy recommendations. We might not implement policy, but certainly we can produce the evidence for sound policies. So I live in Singapore, and the Singapore government talks a lot about evidence-informed policies. So one of my main tasks, in fact, in Singapore, in the different roles I play, is to try and lead research teams that come up with the research information that provides the basis for policy change and the metrics to assess the success or otherwise of those policy changes. So basically, just very quickly, it was felt that we really needed to incentivize the development and use of improved food storage, transport packaging. Again, nothing new. Okay? And we heard many examples, I think, during this particular meeting on different aspects of packaging as well. And I'll come back to that too. Policies to reduce and prevent retail and consumer food wastage in urban environments in particular. Okay? Again, the studies have shown that the urban environments are where most of the food waste is, not the rural. Although, farmers are also consumers, yeah? Government support for innovative means of using food that is wasted in urban environments. We heard some examples from Gail, but there's a lot more that we can do, certainly. Like I think apart from the US, I don't think any other government has a good Samaritan law. Okay? And that's really preventing food reuse, which I'll also mention in a minute. Okay. Now, in the context of SDG, and the climate talks are going at the moment, there's a great opportunity for us to link food waste to basically climate change, and then sustainability. These are some really shocking figures that came out from this report last year. Apart from the fact that, a third of the food, blah, 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 1.6 million tons is lost or wasted. The cost is interesting. The cost to the environment, greenhouse gases and so on, they're humongous really. And here's just some figures here, figures behind it, yeah? So that linkage itself is very important to convince changes in policies that lead to changes in funding to support this kind of work. Sustainability is the other term. I remember having been part of a movement that started the International Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture in the 1970s, late 70s. And in those days, you couldn't talk about sustainability. Because if you did, you were a tree hugger, basically. Nobody listened to you. Okay? It wasn't legitimate at all. Now, today, it's all different. Today, sustainability has become mainstreamed, basically, But ultimately, though, our concern about food waste in the context of sustainability is that you want to be able to leave something for the next generation. I think that's very important. Renewability is very key part of the sustainability concept. And too often we like Gail, I'm also guilty of the triple, kind of bottom line, economic, environmental, ecological, and so on, I wrote an article recently about beyond the triple bottom line that talked about greenwashing. We're seeing a lot of greenwashing occurring now by companies. They say that we're being very sustainable, and yet if you examine critically, they are not. And especially in the area of food waste. Very few companies, in fact, can prove that they have a metric that has shown reduction in food waste or improvement in food waste management as a part of their sustainability compliance. Okay? What is interesting in a country like Singapore, our stock exchange, in fact, requires that every registered company, for the annual report, must report on sustainability and certain metrics. And that's a good way to judge companies by. Okay, back to the real part of my talk, which is novel approaches. I have listed 6 of these that I feel are novel, but I always kind of need to qualify the use of the term novel. Because all of us as scientists and researchers, what we hope today is novel, but by the time we retire or die should be mainstreamed to see the impact of our work. Okay? So whatever was novel several years ago, hopefully has been mainstream today. Yeah? And certainly, what we talk about as novel today, in a few years' time, should become a mainstream activity itself. Otherwise, we really haven't succeeded. Okay? So let me just go through each of these, changing mindsets and attitudes. There are a lot of efforts, and I'm just using Singapore as an example, because I know directly the folks involved, building awareness, education awareness in the schools, starting young. We always say that, habits of mind are developed when you're very young. Okay? Again, telling a story. I have a 5-year-old granddaughter, and because she listens to me a lot, she'll tell me, Grandpa, 0 waste. Don't leave any food behind. Okay? So you got to start inculcating those values at a very early age. And programs like this that were conducted by this particular company, to use compost from food waste to create terrariums, bring parents and students together. Okay? Again, it's not rocket science, but it requires the interest, the community interest, to really nurture this kind of activity. And the more you do, I think the better the entire community will adopt, I think, food waste as a part of the community. Institutionalized efforts are also important. Again, in that example from Singapore, this program was launched in 2015. The National Environment Authority Agency, in Singapore, is the agency, government agency, in charge of food waste management. So they have done surveys and so on, and they launched a program, a national program, both education, penalties included, and so on, to encourage more accountability of food waste at all levels, especially the level of the community, so-called community development councils, which they call them almost like your village councils, municipal councils, And they have reported some very interesting metrics. There's been some success in this program in certain municipalities, but not all of them. Okay? So a national effort as shown by this particular program. There are others in other countries as well, which I won't touch on. Now, this hierarchy itself is also interesting. It resembles what Gail showed. The same agency for Singapore basically publicized, this waste management hierarchy, and saying that the most preferred implementation tactic is to try and prevent and reduce food wastage at source. Okay? This was aimed primarily at institutionalized consumers and also at households, reducing it at source. In other words, don't buy too much, don't throw away too much, and so on. Moving all the way down to recovery itself, which really are the usual divisions in terms of food waste management. So let's spend a few minutes on prevention technology, because there is some interesting stuff happening. This thing about, how much can you prevent at source? Now, somebody once asked me the question, how do you know you've got a problem if you don't define the problem? Okay? If you don't know how much you're wasting, what prompts you to do something about it? Okay? Wastage could be a part and parcel of your everyday practice. So what is interesting to me is that there are programs now out there, and the window system is just one example. I'm familiar with that because I've seen it at work in several institutionalized consumers in Singapore. Okay? And the packaging, of course, the Internet of Things that we've heard quite a few times, the session. What the window system does is to help define the size of the problem. This is just illustrative of a particular kind of program. It's not the only one available in the market, but it's one that's been very aggressive in developing countries and also in Asia as a whole. Yeah? Helping, big hotels, big companies really quantify how much they are wasting with respect to how much they need to produce, to make. Okay? So they look at plate waste, overproduction, preparation, spoilage, and so on. Ultimately, what it does is it allows you to track in the kitchens, the big institution kitchens, and categorize the waste, okay? And you get instant feedback and summaries. Okay? It actually tells you how much you're saving. Okay? In one of the companies I interviewed, they estimated a 30% savings in the cost of their purchasing of food, which actually, argues for spending money on this kind of system itself. Now, speaking to the person in charge, they said it's actually quite tedious to implement in the beginning. But after some practices, it becomes quite routine, in fact. The chef, the chef's helpers and so on, as a matter of fact, just do it. They kind of press buttons and so on. So this is quantifying how much you're wasting, how you're wasting it, as a way to prevent waste in the institutionalized kitchens. Packaging is the other interesting way. I've heard quite a bit about packaging. I think this morning we heard about nanotechnology, for example, and so on. But I was particularly enamored by this slippery packaging that the Virginia Tech folks have developed. I think most of us probably have the frustration of trying to, get the last few drops of tomato ketchup out of the packet and so on. So this slippery packaging, I think, over a macro level, to me has potential to actually reduce what is left behind and unusable itself. Yeah? So that's interesting technology that I think is, lends itself to being watched as something for the future. We heard IoT, we heard about the smart shoe and so on, smart eyeglasses for diets. But with respect to food waste and food waste during transit, the same IoT concept can be applied with sensors that really can tell you, whether your carriages, your lorries, your trucks, and so on, are they being held up anywhere? Are the fruits changing temperature? If so, can they be redirected to somewhere nearby? So basically, IoT is just a set of technologies, what we today call disruptive technologies, sensors, drones, analytics, and so on, all put together. Yeah? But the interesting development in this area is in the area of intelligent drones, which both sense and implement at the same time. Okay, we're starting to see this being developed now to prevent institutionalized loss, especially in regards to food storage in big warehouses. So to me, that's interesting. I think this was developed over in Switzerland, but it's a startup in California that's trying to do this as well now. So that's packaging, IoT. Now, one of the most disruptive technologies, innovations, that I think has been totally misunderstood and not used at all, is the delay ripening or delayed senescence gene. It's GM, fortunately. I don't know how many of you remember the flavor saver tomato when it was first released, yeah? I mean, that was one of the most useful technologies that was shelved, unfortunately, okay, due to public misunderstanding. And I think a really misleading effort on the part of the antis to biotechnology. What it's done is that it's really put a big burden on those in developing countries that don't have cold chain management to ship fresh produce. There are millions of tons of fresh fruits being lost every year in the tropics, vegetables as well, yeah? if indeed, you could have delayed senescence trait as a trait built into the fresh veggies and fruits, you'll be saving anywhere up to 30%, 40% of fresh fruits very easily. Okay? Strong evidence of this as one travels around the developing world. So that's one disruptive technology I think is here at the moment, it's proven, but yet it's not used. Now the other is even more interesting. I know somebody else showed this morning the vertical farming, the condos. Now vertical farming does not have to be in tall condos. We're actually looking at the concept right now. Okay? It can be what we call PFALs, plant factories with artificial light, okay, which are basically enclosed factories where plants are grown with filtered air, so there are no insect problems at all, and where the quality of the air is enhanced, CO2 levels are increased, and it's all artificial lighting. Yeah. I'm not sure how familiar you folks are with this, but there are over 150 of these now in Japan. Singapore, there's 25 now. Taiwan has quite a few. Mainland China, over 100. The rationale for this is that it buffers plant protection from the elements and from pests and diseases. Okay? And what is the relevance to waste management? The only thing that you can't eat is the root, if you don't want to eat it, basically. It's all hydroponics. Okay? And it's actually quite amazing. It uses less water. Okay? The energy part it has still to be sorted out, I must confess. Yeah? But in terms of wastage, there's almost zero waste. Okay? And I've studied some of these, and the artificial lighting itself is very interesting. We're all used, I'm a botanist by training. We're all used to thinking that visible light is what we need. But the science shows that that's not true anymore. There's just two wavelengths, basically, that plants need to enhance growth. The purplish color, that you see in the bluish color. And these plants grow at roughly 30% more faster, okay? Faster than ordinary plants do. And this is interesting too. The first factory in Singapore was built by Panasonic. The Panasonic company, the electronics, because they saw the potential there. And they saw a use for the LED technology. Yeah? And they were the first to commercialize, basically, plant factory PFAL vegetables. In fact, for those of you who come to Singapore, you actually buy them. And they're really smart about it to reduce waste. They don't sell the whole vegetable. Okay? They got HACCP certification, cut up vegetables, mix 8 of them together. They've got punnets of different kinds of vegetables, one to perk you up, one for antioxidants, and so on. The salad dressings are all provided, 80 grams, basically enough for a meal. Okay? That's their approach to trying to reduce vegetable waste through their plant factories. Okay? We see this spreading, really spreading throughout Asia. We used to hear that this won't work. People like natural plants and so on, but that's not true anymore. My Fulbright fellow last year did a survey in Singapore, and she interviewed millennials versus folks a bit older and so on. And she found a distinctive age distribution in acceptance of food produced with new technology. Again, it's not rocket science. Very obvious. Millennials are more accepting of food from new technologies. In fact, they're even strong advocates for that. Okay, I've got to move on. Reuse is the other big category. Prevention, reuse. Reuse, is probably, I think, the least utilized of the different approaches because of the hazards associated with reuse, especially in the tropics and developing countries with no cold chain management. Yeah? I've selected this one example of this big integrated resort, Marina Bay Sands, which belongs to Las Vegas Sands. It's one example of a company. They have 20,000 employees, basically, and quite a few people go through the complex every day. Their reuse program involves donating food, which are collected every day, and certified by their own chefs that is still good to eat. Okay? And they organize collection wagons from volunteers who come and distribute all those food to the food banks and to a voluntary organization called Food from the Heart. Okay? About roughly 8 tons of food, roughly, I think, 2018, I think, And all this is part of their sustainability statement for the company. And just, again, linking food waste to sustainability, which I was actually, very appreciative of, that they recognize that sustainability is not just about saving water, energy, and so on, that food waste is an integral part of that, and something you can do very positively about. Yeah? So moving on, in a neighboring country, Malaysia, the same thing. Okay? They're trying to prevent, they call it food wastage, but basically reuse of food through food banks that they send all over the country with volunteers. Okay? So this just came out a few weeks ago in the papers over there. Okay? Now, the next category is recycling. I think that's the one that most hits us when we talk about food waste management. Usually we think about recycling. Okay? There's a lot of recycling research, a lot of recycling applications in Asia at the moment, a lot of it. Again, started with the first example, the same resort in Singapore. By the way, how many of you have seen this resort? Those are not from Singapore. Yeah, it's actually quite impressive. They go through tons and tons of food every day. You know, they have a program now where they've got 5 anaerobic digesters, and I can't remember the figure they quoted me every day, but over the whole year, they've got about roughly 600,000 kilos of food waste that they put into digesters. Yeah, and those are then converted into almost for fertigation, basically, composted water, okay, that they then use to grow their own herb garden, which then supplies back to their own kitchens. Yeah. See, this is one resort where every staff member gets to eat 3 meals a day free of charge. Yeah. It's a way to keep staff, and they grow their own vegetables, herbs that are used in the kitchen itself. Yeah. But linked to this, and back to what I said earlier about non-traditional security, water. Water is a key element that's linked to food wastage. They collect about 6,000 liters of water every day from the 3,000 air conditioning units, the condensate basically. And it's actually not even grey water, it's quite clean water for that matter. It's not as good as distilled water. They use the water for toilets, to water plants, and for the water displays. Yeah? See, to me, that's closing to a circular system, but not quite yet. Yeah, there are some things they haven't done yet. Yeah. So moving on. I forgot to mention that they recycle used cooking oil as well. Okay, there's a collector that comes around and converts this into biodiesel. Okay. Most of the cooking oil is from palm oil, usually, or from corn. And it all goes to making biodiesel. Okay, and this is just a picture of the garden that they have over there, the eco garden, that uses all their basic compost from the food waste. The government, as an example of government's interests around Asia, our premier research organization called A-Star has partnered with a lot of private companies to really look at technologies. Now in this case, this company claims, Westcom, to have a system that turns food waste into odorless fertilizer in 24 hours. Okay? I mean, I can't kind of testify to how good this is. I haven't seen it yet. It's actually quite new. So, then in China, a really interesting example. We talk about eating insects. Okay, China has two of the world's biggest cockroach farms in the world. This particular one in Shandong, okay, they 60 tons of food waste each day, okay, to grow cockroaches. Okay. Now, once you get beyond the yuck factor, there's actually a lot of sense in that, because cockroaches feed indiscriminately on all kinds of waste, especially if they're hungry. Very short life cycles as well. So they use the cockroaches mainly to make feed, okay, animal feed and others. But they're quite, I thought this is a real novelty. Cockroach lava sushi. Personally, I'm not sure I would eat it, but they claim it's a success. Okay? But certainly, I think in terms of using it as a snack, apparently there are people that actually eat cockroach snacks. Okay? But more importantly, this is used, crushed up as protein, okay, for fish feed in particular, to mix it with the soybean feed to reduce costs. Now, I used to be a fish farmer in Singapore, and one of my main costs is feed, because it comes through Cargill. It's mainly soybean corn, and it's really expensive. So we've been experimenting with using cockroaches, but also another insect larva to do that. I've got to move on. But insects for food is actually not such a novel idea. Now, if you go to Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, it's very common. When I was researching for my book, I went to a market outside Vientiane in Laos, and there's a special market that only sells wild produce. One section is all insects. And when you approach the section, the aroma is actually amazing. Okay? It's actually quite attractive aroma. And they serve cold beer together with the snacks. So those of you who will ever travel to Vientiane, find out where this market is actually fascinating. I'm running out of time. Okay, finish off. Now, another good example of recycle is another cockroach factory which produces medicinal purpose cockroaches, okay, for traditional Chinese medicine. And a new superfood is cockroach milk. Google it, okay? It's real, cockroach milk. It's not the white milk they used to, it's a crystalline protein that's exuded, and it's touted to be one of the big new superfoods nowadays, yeah? For those who want to pay for it. Recovery, I won't say much about it. But let me just finish off by the secularity, okay? There are a lot of initiatives around Asia now on a micro-circularity level. Okay, this is just one example. This Citizens Farm in Singapore, where basically they collect compost from the community, okay, food waste, compost it, and then produce the black soldier fly, okay, instead of cockroaches. This is actually more acceptable to many people, and they put it in an enclosed, basically, screen house. They use the larvae, crush it up, and mix it with animal feed for chicken and for fish. Very high protein according to the FAO. And then another example of micro-circularity is this resort called the Siloso Beach Resort, which again uses all the compost, in this case vermiculture included, to grow their own vegetables. So I'm going to finish off full circle here and just mention that some of the take-home points really are, that novel approaches and technologies are being developed and trialed in many countries, but they have to make financial sense to become mainstream. I mean, that's again not rocket science, yeah? But modern technology mindset changes are really key to the public accepting innovations. And this applies to any technology, especially technologies that deal with food waste. And thirdly, education and communication. Again, other speakers have stressed this, which is why we wrote this book to really explain some of the food issues, including eating insects and food waste, yeah? So I think a lot of scientists need to write more books, and instead of peer-reviewed papers that can be used to communicate to the broader community. Okay? I would urge you to get a copy of the book, make my publisher happy. Thank you.